a bright teenager, a jealous midshipman, and a promising cadet. 3 lives colliding in a deadly triangle of obsession. What began as young ambition ended in betrayal and murder. This is the haunting story of Diane Zamora, David Graham, and Adrienne Jones, where love turned lethal in suburban Texas. In the mid-1990s, the suburbs of Texas were like many other American communities, where families lived in quiet neighborhoods and high school students prepared for their futures with optimism. It was a kind of environment where young people joined sports teams, dreamed of scholarships, and looked toward careers in the military, medicine, or law. For those who knew her, 16-year-old Adrienne Jones fit perfectly into that picture. She was bright, social, and active on her high school track team in Mansfield, Texas. Friends described her as cheerful and fun, someone who had a whole life ahead of her. She was not the kind of person anyone could imagine becoming the center of one of the most shocking crimes in the state's history. At the same time, just a short drive away, Diane Michelle Zamora was charting a very different path. At 18, Diane was already a midshipman at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. She came from Crowley, Texas, and had worked tirelessly in school to prove herself academically and athletically. People who knew her often described her as focused and determined, the kind of student who was disciplined enough to handle the pressures of a military academy. Her relationship with David Graham, however, revealed a very different side of her personality, one marked by intensity, jealousy, and possessiveness. David Graham was the same age as Diane. He had graduated from Mansfield High School and earned admission to the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Like Diane, David was smart, ambitious, and athletic. Teachers and classmates had seen him as a young man destined for success. He ran track, excelled academically, and seemed well on his way to a promising military career. To friends, David and Diane looked like a power couple, 2 high achievers bonded by shared discipline and future goals. But their relationship was not built on balance. It was consumed by obsession and control. Diane demanded loyalty and proof of devotion, and David, for reasons that remain hard to explain even now, seemed willing to give it to her no matter the cost. The story began to take its fateful turn in late 1995, when David confessed to Diane that he had a brief sexual encounter with another girl, Adrienne Jones. It happened after a track meet when David gave Adrienne a ride home. For him, it may have been a careless mistake or a lapse in judgment. For Diane, it was unforgivable. To her, Adrienne became the symbol of betrayal, and David's confession ignited a rage that would spiral far beyond the normal bounds of teenage jealousy. Diane demanded that something be done. Words turned to threats, and threats turned into a plan that would end in murder. On the night of December 4, 1995, David called Adrienne at her home in Mansfield. He told her he wanted to meet up. Adrienne agreed, unaware of what was waiting for her. She snuck out of her house after her parents had gone to bed, a common act for a teenager who thought she was meeting a boy she knew. David drove up in his car, but Adrienne did not realize that Diane was hiding in the back seat. The drive took them to a rural area in Grand Prairie, far from any neighborhood or streetlight. What happened next would shock everyone who later heard the details. Once parked in a secluded area, Diane emerged from hiding. The confrontation was immediate. Diane accused Adrienne of sleeping with her fiancé, and in the chaos that followed, Diane struck Adrienne on the head with a dumbbell. The blow was brutal, but it did not kill her. Injured and terrified, Adrienne tried to escape, but David pulled out a handgun. In the end, he fired 2 shots, leaving Adrienne's body on the side of the road. David and Diane drove away, their clothes stained with evidence of what they had done. For Adrienne's family, the nightmare began the next morning, when her body was discovered by a passing driver. The discovery of a young girl's body in such a violent state rattled the quiet community. Police quickly launched an investigation, but at first, the case presented more questions than answers. Adrienne's parents were devastated. They described their daughter as a good student, a loving daughter, and someone with no known enemies. Friends and classmates were shocked, unable to imagine who would have wanted to harm her. The crime scene itself offered few immediate leads. The randomness of a location suggested that Adrienne had been lured out and killed deliberately, but investigators had no clear suspect in the days that followed. As the investigation moved forward, authorities interviewed friends, classmates, and neighbors. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of Adrienne's social life and the people she knew. David Graham's name appeared early in the inquiry because of his connection to her from track. But at that stage, there was no direct evidence tying him to the crime. He had already left for the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, and Diane had returned to Annapolis for her studies. On the surface, both appeared to have moved on with their lives. Still, beneath that surface, there were cracks forming, and whispers about what really happened that night began to circulate. What stood out in those early months after the murder was how controlled and calculated Diane and David tried to appear. Friends recalled that Diane often boasted about her relationship, framing it as unbreakable and destined for marriage. Others noticed how intense her jealousy seemed whenever David interacted with other girls. David, meanwhile, portrayed himself as committed to Diane, even when it meant distancing himself from other friendships. It was a dynamic that some friends thought unusual, but no one suspected just how far it had already gone. The investigation pressed on into 1996, but it wasn't until later that year that the first real breakthroughs came. Rumors began to surface that Diane and David had confided in others about their crime. Accounts varied, but the idea that they had told classmates about killing a girl began to gain traction. These whispers eventually reached the ears of authorities, who took them seriously. Detectives began piecing together a story that connected David, Diane, and Adrienne in a deadly triangle of jealousy. Bit by bit, the facade started to crack, and the reality of what had happened on that December night became harder for Diane and David to hide. By the time investigators closed in, the young couple's once promising futures were unraveling. The Naval Academy midshipman and the Air Force Academy cadet had crossed a line that would change everything. What began as a relationship defined by ambition and promise had spiraled into a violent pact of control, betrayal, and murder. And as police gathered more information, the truth about how Adrienne Jones lost her life would finally begin to come into focus. The murder of Adrienne Jones had left Mansfield reeling. The image of a bright 16-year-old, taken from her family in such a violent way, haunted the community. Police worked tirelessly, but in those first months, they struggled with the absence of direct evidence. The crime scene gave them little to hold onto, and Adrienne's life had seemed so ordinary that it was difficult to imagine who could have targeted her. Still, investigators knew that this was not a random killing. The way she had been lured from her home pointed to someone she knew and trusted. That knowledge kept the search alive even when progress felt slow. Behind the scenes, Diane Zamora and David Graham continued with their lives as if nothing had happened. Diane returned to the Naval Academy in Maryland, where she resumed her studies. Her classmates described her as serious and disciplined, but also intensely emotional. Those who knew her sometimes saw flashes of jealousy when she spoke about David, who by then was in Colorado at the Air Force Academy. David maintained the image of a young cadet focused on training and academics. On the surface, both looked like model students representing the next generation of military leaders. But when they returned home to Texas during breaks, the secret of what they had done began to spill out in small but damaging ways. Friends later recalled conversations where Diane hinted at the crime. Some said she had admitted to being involved in something terrible. Others remembered hearing David mention that a girl had been killed because of him. At first, many brushed it off as exaggeration or dark jokes, but the consistency of the stories made people uneasy. Slowly, rumors spread among classmates and acquaintances. In a case where police had been grasping for leads, these whispers became critical. By 1996, detectives had begun to connect the dots, and suspicion turned toward the couple who had once seemed untouchable. For investigators, the challenge was not just proving who was responsible, but understanding the dynamic between Diane and David. They were only 18 at the time of the murder, yet their relationship had been marked by control and obsession. Diane, fiercely possessive, demanded loyalty at any cost. David, eager to keep her approval, gave in to demands that most people would have found impossible. The psychology of that relationship, investigators believed, played a central role in the crime. Diane's jealousy had boiled over after David confessed to a one-time sexual encounter with Adrienne, and David's need to appease Diane had pushed him into participating in a killing that shocked even seasoned detectives. When police finally brought Diane and David in for questioning, the facade began to crumble. They had lived with the secret for months, but under pressure, inconsistencies appeared in their stories. Detectives pressed harder, confronting them with the rumors that had been circulating. Piece by piece, the horrifying truth emerged. The account that surfaced was as chilling as it was tragic. A teenage girl killed because of jealousy, her life cut short by a pair of overachievers whose futures had once seemed so bright. The timeline of the crime became clearer. On the night of December 4, 1995, David had lured Adrienne out of her home with a late-night phone call. He drove her to a remote area while Diane hid in the back seat. Once there, Diane confronted Adrienne, accusing her of sleeping with David. The confrontation turned violent when Diane struck Adrienne with a dumbbell. Despite the blow, Adrienne was still alive, struggling in confusion and pain. It was then that David took out a handgun and fired 2 fatal shots, leaving her body behind as they fled into the night. The sheer coldness of the plan and the calculated steps to lure Adrienne revealed just how far the couple had gone to protect their relationship. For Adrienne's parents, the unraveling of the truth was unbearable. Their daughter had been targeted for no reason other than jealousy. She had trusted David enough to leave her home that night, never suspecting the trap awaiting her. Her family had lived for months with unanswered questions, and now the answers were more devastating than they could have imagined. Adrienne had been caught in the middle of a toxic bond between 2 people who seemed unable to control their emotions. The randomness of it made it even harder to accept. She had not been in a dangerous crowd or living a risky life. She was simply a teenager who had made the mistake of crossing paths with the wrong people. The story of Diane and David soon became national news. The contrast between their promising military careers and the brutality of the crime fascinated the public. How could 2 disciplined young cadets, trained to uphold honor and responsibility, commit such an act? The question lingered in every headline. Reporters dug into their backgrounds, interviewing classmates, teachers, and family members. What emerged was a portrait of a couple whose relationship had been admired by some but seen as troubling by others. Diane's intensity, combined with David's willingness to follow her lead, had created a volatile mix. That volatility had exploded the night Adrienne was killed. As more details came out, public opinion hardened. The image of Diane as a bright Naval Academy midshipman gave way to that of a controlling partner consumed by jealousy. David, once seen as a promising Air Force cadet, now looked like someone whose loyalty had crossed into blind obedience. Together, they had turned a private act of betrayal into a public tragedy. The public wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted justice for Adrienne. In the months leading up to trial, investigators worked to ensure the evidence was airtight. They gathered testimony from those who had heard Diane and David speak about the crime, and they built a timeline that placed the couple at the scene. Witnesses described Diane's obsession with David and the way she demanded that he prove his devotion. Others recalled David's comments about the murder, which revealed both pride and fear. Slowly, a case was built that would withstand scrutiny in court. The impact on both academies was profound. The Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy, institutions built on discipline and honor, now found themselves tied to a murder case that drew intense media coverage. Officials from both schools distanced themselves, emphasizing that the crime had occurred before the cadets had fully entered military life. Still, the shock rippled through classmates and instructors who had once seen Diane and David as future leaders. The contrast between their training and their crime was too stark to ignore. As the trial dates drew closer, anticipation grew. The community of Mansfield, still grieving Adrienne's loss, prepared for the emotional ordeal of hearing the case laid out in detail. Her parents faced the prospect of reliving the worst night of their lives, while Diane and David's families braced for the collapse of the futures they had once imagined for their children. What had begun as a teenage relationship had escalated into an obsession that ended with murder, and now the judicial system would take its turn in uncovering the full scope of what had happened. The path toward justice was not quick, but it was inevitable. The truth was too strong, the evidence too consistent, and the impact of the crime too deep to ignore. As Diane Zamora and David Graham prepared to stand trial, the stage was set for the final act of a story that had begun with promise and ended with bloodshed. The young couple, who had once seemed destined for military glory, would instead be remembered for their role in one of Texas's most infamous murders. And in the background, the memory of Adrienne Jones lingered, a reminder of the innocent life stolen by jealousy and obsession. By the time the trials of Diane Zamora and David Graham arrived, the story had grown beyond a local tragedy. It had become a national spectacle, the kind of case that drew reporters from across the country and filled newspapers with details about young love, jealousy, and murder. The courtroom was crowded with journalists, curious members of the public, and of course the families of those involved. For Adrienne Jones's parents, each day in court was another reminder of the daughter they had lost, a daughter who should have been preparing for college and the next chapter of her life. For Diane and David's families, the trials were a slow collapse of the futures they had once envisioned for their children, who had seemed destined for military honor and success, but were now on trial for their lives. The prosecution built its case carefully. They laid out the story of a young couple consumed by obsession and control, one that turned deadly after a confession of infidelity. Witnesses testified about Diane's intensity and her insistence that David prove his devotion to her. Others recalled conversations in which David boasted about killing a girl, or in which Diane hinted at involvement in something terrible. These statements, paired with the timeline investigators had pieced together, painted a picture of premeditation and intent. The state emphasized that this was not a crime of passion in the heat of the moment, but a deliberate plan carried out step by step. Adrienne had been lured from her home, ambushed, attacked with a dumbbell, and shot. The brutality of the act, prosecutors argued, showed how far the couple had gone in service of their toxic bond. The defense teams faced an uphill battle. For Diane, attorneys tried to frame her as someone manipulated by David, suggesting she was under his influence more than a willing participant. For David, the strategy was reversed. His defense tried to shift more blame onto Diane, portraying her as controlling, jealous, and capable of pushing him into violence he would not have otherwise committed. The problem for both sides was that the evidence showed them acting together, each playing a role in Adrienne's death. Neither could escape the fact that without their combined actions, Adrienne would still be alive. Testimony during the trials revealed chilling details. Friends of Diane testified about her obsession with loyalty and her tendency to demand extreme gestures of devotion from David. Others recounted conversations where David admitted to killing a girl for Diane. These accounts were reinforced by physical evidence and the sequence of events established by investigators. The prosecution reminded the jury that Adrienne Jones had no reason to be in that field in Grand Prairie on her own. She had been tricked into leaving her house because she trusted David, someone she knew from track. That trust had been her downfall. The state emphasized the betrayal of that trust as much as the violence that followed. As the trials unfolded, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy. Adrienne's family sat through each detail, listening as strangers described the final hours of their daughter's life. Diane and David, who once had been cadets at prestigious military academies, now sat at defense tables, facing the reality of life in prison. The contrast was stark, and the media covered it relentlessly. Headlines framed the story as a fall from grace, a tale of two promising young people whose ambition had been overshadowed by jealousy and murder. When it came time for the juries to decide, the evidence left little room for doubt. In February 1998, Diane Zamora was convicted of capital murder. The jury deliberated only briefly before returning the guilty verdict. Though prosecutors could have sought the death penalty, they chose not to pursue it. Instead, the sentence was life in prison, with eligibility for parole only after 40 years. David Graham faced his own trial later that year. He, too, was convicted of capital murder and received the same punishment: life in prison with no chance of parole until at least 40 years had passed. The verdicts brought a measure of closure, though nothing could undo the loss of Adrienne Jones. For her family, there was relief in knowing that the people responsible for her death would spend decades behind bars. But the pain remained. They had lost a daughter, a sister, and a friend. The legal system had delivered justice, but it could not return what had been stolen from them that December night. For Diane Zamora and David Graham, the convictions marked the end of the lives they had once imagined. Both had entered elite military academies with futures that could have led to leadership, careers of service, and stability. Instead, their names were forever tied to a crime that shocked the nation. In the years that followed, Diane tried to appeal her conviction, arguing errors in her trial. But in 2005, her conviction was upheld. The courts affirmed what the jury had decided years earlier. She was guilty of playing a central role in the murder of Adrienne Jones. David Graham also pursued appeals, but the outcome remained the same. The evidence against them was too strong, and the justice system was firm in its decision. Life in prison became their reality. For Diane, it meant adjusting from the rigid structure of the Naval Academy to the confines of a cell, a dramatic fall from the disciplined life she once led. For David, it meant trading the Air Force Academy's promise for decades behind bars. Both remained eligible for parole after 40 years, which placed the possibility of release around the year 2036. Until then, they would live out their sentences, reminders of how quickly youthful ambition can be destroyed by jealousy and violence. The case left a lasting impact on the community of Mansfield and on Texas as a whole. It became one of those stories people never forgot, retold in documentaries, books, and television specials. The murder of Adrienne Jones was not just about a crime. It was about the devastating consequences of obsession. Two teenagers who had everything ahead of them gave it all away in an act of senseless violence, and a young girl lost her life because of it. The story resonated because it seemed almost unbelievable that people so young, so promising, could carry out such a deliberate and brutal act. Looking back, many have tried to understand what drove Diane Zamora and David Graham to that point. Was it Diane's jealousy, David's weakness, or the toxic combination of the two? Theories abound, but the truth remains simple. Together, they made a choice to end a life. And that choice defined the rest of their own. The legacy of the case is not the promise they once had, but the life they took and the pain they caused. It is the story of Adrienne Jones that endures, remembered by her family and friends as the vibrant, kind teenager she was, and as the victim of a crime that should never have happened. The finality of the verdicts and the upholding of the convictions years later cemented the story in the public consciousness. Diane Zamora and David Graham will forever be remembered not as military cadets or bright students, but as the couple who conspired to kill out of jealousy. Their actions destroyed not only Adrienne's future, but their own. The case stands as one of the most haunting reminders of how fragile life can be when consumed by obsession, and how quickly youthful promise can be replaced by tragedy. For Adrienne's family, the memory of their daughter remains, a constant reminder of the bright light extinguished on a dark December night in 1995. A young soldier vanishes from Fort Hood, Texas, in 2020, sparking outrage and a desperate search. What follows is a chilling tale of betrayal, secrecy, and violence that exposed deep cracks within the U.S. Army and led to one of the most shocking true crime cases in recent history. In the spring of 2020, life on the Fort Hood Army base in Killeen, Texas, moved at its usual steady pace. Soldiers trained, reported for duty, and carried out the routines that defined military service. Among them was Specialist Vanessa Guillen, a 20-year-old Army soldier from Houston. She was known to her family as driven and disciplined, a young woman who had enlisted to serve her country and was proud of the path she had chosen. Vanessa belonged to a close-knit Mexican-American family who supported her ambitions and believed she was destined for something greater. Her parents and sisters spoke often about her dedication, her strength, and her resilience in facing challenges most her age would never encounter. Fort Hood itself had long been one of the largest and most active U.S. military installations. Thousands of soldiers and civilians lived and worked there, forming a community within a community. Yet behind its gates, the sprawling base also carried a history of violence and unsolved cases that left some families unsettled. For Vanessa, it became the place where her life would come to a tragic end, setting off a chain of events that exposed deep problems in how the military handled both violence and accountability. Vanessa was last seen on April 22, 2020, leaving her work area in the armory room where she had been assigned that day. When she didn't return home or respond to calls, her family quickly realized something was wrong. Vanessa was not someone who disappeared without explanation. She lived with discipline. She stayed in constant touch with her mother and sisters, and she had plans for her future that kept her motivated. For her to suddenly vanish was alarming. Her disappearance raised questions immediately, and her family pressed the Army for answers. At first, official responses were cautious and vague. Searches began across the base, but little progress was made in the early days. The Guillen family was left in anguish, holding rallies, speaking to the media, and demanding to know what had happened to their daughter. The pressure mounted as the weeks went on. The family's public appeals gained national attention, drawing supporters, activists, and members of Congress into the conversation. As more people learned about Vanessa's case, it became a symbol of broader concerns within the military: harassment, silence, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Vanessa herself had confided to her family before her disappearance that she was being harassed at Fort Hood. She never named the individual responsible, but her words left them fearful that her safety had been compromised by the very environment in which she served. As investigators searched, suspicion began to center on a 20-year-old soldier named Aaron David Robinson. Robinson was an Army specialist stationed at Fort Hood, working in the same area as Vanessa. He was young, like her, but the paths they were on could not have been more different. Robinson's connection to her became clearer as investigators pieced together her final moments. He was the last known person to have seen her alive, and inconsistencies in his account raised red flags. Behind the scenes, Robinson was also in a relationship with a civilian named Cecily Aguilar. She was 22 years old at the time, living in Killeen, Texas, and working at a local business. Aguilar was not part of the military, but her connection to Robinson bound her to Fort Hood and, ultimately, to the horrific crime that unfolded there. Robinson and Aguilar's relationship was turbulent, built on secrecy and intensity, and it would later become the key to understanding how Vanessa's disappearance turned into a murder case. The day Vanessa went missing, Robinson killed her inside the armory. He struck her repeatedly with a hammer, a brutal attack that ended her life in a matter of moments. What motivated him remains debated, but what is clear is that he acted with cold calculation after the murder. He needed help to cover up the crime, and he turned to Cecily Aguilar. In the hours that followed, Robinson left the base and picked Aguilar up. Together, they carried out a plan that revealed both desperation and cruelty. They transported Vanessa's body to a remote location near the Leon River, about 20 miles from Fort Hood. The secluded area was chosen to keep her remains hidden, away from the heavy presence of investigators and search teams still combing the base. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. Robinson and Aguilar attempted to destroy the body. They dismembered the remains, tried to burn them, and then buried them in 3 shallow graves. It was a gruesome and deliberate effort to erase all evidence of what Robinson had done. Aguilar, though not present for the murder itself, became an accessory in one of the most disturbing cover-ups in recent military history. Meanwhile, Vanessa's family continued to plead for answers. They stood outside Fort Hood with signs demanding justice, refusing to allow her name to fade into another unsolved case. Their pain was visible in every interview, and their persistence kept the story alive in national headlines. For many, Vanessa's disappearance was not just about one soldier. It became a test of whether the Army would be transparent, accountable, and responsive to the families who entrusted their loved ones to its care. As May turned to June, frustration grew. Protesters gathered across Texas, calling for more aggressive action. Lawmakers began questioning the Army's handling of the case. Vanessa's face appeared on posters, on social media campaigns, and in rallies across the country. Her disappearance had become a national issue, igniting a movement that demanded change within the military. For investigators, the search intensified. Leads pointed more directly to Robinson, whose behavior had grown suspicious. He maintained his position on base, but seemed increasingly restless. Aguilar, too, came under quiet surveillance as authorities began to uncover her connection to Robinson. Still, without a body, charges remained difficult to pursue. The case hung in limbo, with mounting public pressure but little tangible evidence to bring closure. The breakthrough came on June 30, 2020, when human remains were found near the Leon River. Search teams, acting on leads connected to Robinson and Aguilar, uncovered the buried remains. Though confirmation would take time, the discovery shifted the case dramatically. Investigators now had physical evidence pointing back to Robinson, and the facade he had maintained began to collapse. News of the discovery spread quickly, devastating Vanessa's family, but also confirming what they had feared all along. Their daughter had not simply gone missing. She had been murdered. For the public, the revelation was enraging. For the Army, it was a crisis. And for Robinson and Aguilar, it marked the beginning of the end of their desperate attempt to hide the truth. At this point in the investigation, all attention turned squarely onto Robinson and Aguilar. Their secret had been unearthed, and the consequences were about to unravel in a way neither could escape. The discovery of human remains near the Leon River in late June 2020 changed everything. For more than 2 months, the disappearance of specialist Vanessa Guillen had been a mystery that tormented her family and captured national attention. The search, the vigils, the protests, all of it had led to that grim moment when investigators unearthed what appeared to be the evidence they had been seeking. Though official confirmation would take a few days, those who had followed the case closely felt the weight of what had been found. It was the moment that proved Vanessa had not simply vanished. She had been taken from her family in the most brutal way possible. While search teams worked to confirm the identity of the remains, federal and military investigators moved quickly to close in on their main suspect, Specialist Aaron David Robinson. Robinson was only 20 years old, a young soldier whose name had surfaced repeatedly in connection to Vanessa. He had been one of the last people to see her alive, and inconsistencies in his statements had only deepened suspicion. Now, with the discovery near the Leon River, investigators were certain that his connection to the crime was undeniable. In the days after the discovery, Robinson was kept under surveillance. He was not yet under arrest, but authorities monitored his movements closely. They knew they were dealing with someone capable of extreme violence, and they feared he might attempt to flee or harm himself once he realized the investigation was closing in. Robinson lived with the knowledge of what he had done, and his behavior grew increasingly erratic as pressure mounted. Cecily Aguilar, Robinson's 22-year-old girlfriend, also found herself under scrutiny. A civilian living in Killeen, she had been drawn into the case through her relationship with Robinson. Aguilar had no military ties, but she had played a direct role in helping cover up Vanessa's murder. Investigators learned that she had been with Robinson on the night of the crime, when they transported Vanessa's body off base. She had helped him dismember the remains, had assisted in attempting to burn them, and had helped bury them in multiple shallow graves near the Leon River. What had once been their secret was now unraveling under the weight of evidence and witness statements. For the Guillen family, the days between the discovery of the remains and the confirmation of identity were excruciating. They had spent weeks pleading for answers, holding rallies outside Fort Hood, and demanding that the Army treat Vanessa's disappearance with urgency. Now, the discovery validated their worst fears. Their daughter, their sister, the young soldier they had encouraged to serve her country, had been murdered and hidden away in a manner that defied comprehension. The grief was overwhelming, But the family's determination did not fade. They continued to speak out, turning their pain into a call for accountability, not only for Vanessa's murder, but for the culture at Fort Hood that they believed had failed her. By June 30th, the timeline of events leading to Vanessa's disappearance became clearer. On April 22nd, Robinson had attacked her in the armory, striking her repeatedly with a hammer. After killing her, he placed her body in a container and moved it off base later that day. He then contacted Aguilar, asking for her help. Together, they took Vanessa's remains to the remote area along the Leon River. There, over the course of hours, they dismembered and attempted to burn the body before burying it in shallow graves. It was a gruesome effort to erase any trace of the crime. But despite their attempts, evidence remained, and the persistence of search teams would eventually uncover it. When investigators began questioning Aguilar, her story shifted multiple times. At first, she denied involvement, but as evidence mounted, she admitted to her role in helping Robinson after the murder. What stood out to investigators was not only the crime itself, but the cold and deliberate manner in which both Robinson and Aguilar carried out the cover-up. It was not a moment of panic. It was a series of calculated steps taken over time, each designed to hide the truth and mislead investigators. The pressure on Robinson intensified after the remains were found. He was placed under watch at Fort Hood, but on the night of June 30th, 2020, he managed to slip away. When law enforcement attempted to approach him near Killeen, Robinson pulled out a gun and shot himself. He died instantly, never facing trial for his role in Vanessa's murder. For many, his death felt like another injustice, robbing Vanessa's family of the chance to confront him in court and hear him answer for what he had done. With Robinson gone, attention turned fully to Aguilar. She was arrested and charged with conspiracy to tamper with evidence and multiple counts of tampering. Unlike Robinson, she would face the legal system, and her actions would be examined in detail. Her involvement raised disturbing questions. Why had she agreed to help Robinson? What compelled her to participate in the dismemberment and burial of Vanessa's body? And what did it reveal about her relationship with him that she was willing to take such horrific steps? As Aguilar awaited trial, the Guillen family's pursuit of justice widened beyond the courtroom. Vanessa's death had become a symbol of something larger, the failures of the military system to protect its own. Reports surfaced that Vanessa had confided to her family about being harassed on base. Though she had not filed a formal complaint, her words suggested a culture where young soldiers, especially women, felt unsafe and unsupported. The Guillen family demanded reform, and their voices resonated with countless others who shared similar experiences. Public outrage grew, and lawmakers called for investigations into Fort Hood. The base's history of violence and unsolved cases came under intense scrutiny. Vanessa's case became the catalyst for national conversations about harassment, assault, and accountability within the armed forces. It was not only about one soldier's murder, but about a system that had allowed patterns of misconduct to persist for years. In the summer of 2020, marches and vigils were held across the country in Vanessa's name. Supporters carried signs, wore shirts with her picture, and called out for justice. Her story inspired the I Am Vanessa Guillen movement, a campaign that gave voice to countless service members who said they too had faced harassment or abuse. The movement spread quickly, gathering momentum and forcing the military to confront issues it had long struggled to address. Back in Texas, the Guillen family continued to lead the fight. They traveled to Washington, D.C., met with lawmakers, and demanded legislative action to change how the military handled reports of harassment and assault. Their advocacy helped lay the foundation for reforms, including the eventual introduction of legislation aimed at removing such cases from the chain of command and ensuring greater accountability. Meanwhile, investigators continued building the case against Aguilar. They traced her movements, examined her communications with Robinson, and pieced together a detailed timeline of how the cover-up unfolded. Her own words during interviews revealed her complicity. Though she was not the one who killed Vanessa, her willingness to participate in disposing of the body made her an active accomplice. The evidence against her was overwhelming. By the time summer turned to fall, the story had reached every corner of the country. Vanessa Guillen's name had become synonymous with a fight for justice and reform in the military. The young soldier who once dreamed of serving her country had, through her death, sparked a movement that demanded change. The grief of her family was immeasurable, but their persistence ensured that her memory would not be forgotten, and that others might be protected from the same fate. For Cecily Aguilar, the road ahead would be one of trials and sentencing, as she faced the consequences of her decisions. For the Guillen family, the pursuit of justice would continue until accountability was fully achieved. And for the public, the case remained a reminder of the dangers hidden within institutions that demand trust, but too often fail to provide safety. The events of April through June 2020 revealed the darkest side of life at Fort Hood. A young woman's life had been taken, her body desecrated, and her family forced to endure months of agony before the truth came to light. Yet out of that tragedy emerged a movement that called for justice, not just for Vanessa, but for every soldier who had suffered in silence. After Aaron Robinson's death in June 2020, the burden of accountability fell squarely on Cecily Aguilar. At 22 years old, she was no longer just Robinson's civilian girlfriend from Killeen, Texas. She was now the only surviving accomplice in the brutal crime that ended Specialist Vanessa Guillen's life. Federal prosecutors charged her with conspiracy to tamper with evidence and multiple counts of tampering with evidence. Unlike Robinson, who had taken his own life before facing justice, Aguilar would have to answer in a courtroom for her actions. As investigators pieced together the timeline, Aguilar's involvement came into sharp focus. She was not present when Robinson killed Vanessa inside the Fort Hood Armory, but she became central to the cover-up. Her own admissions showed that she had helped Robinson transport the body, dismember it, attempt to burn it, and then bury the remains near the Leon River. The gruesome details painted a picture of deliberate, methodical steps taken over hours to conceal a crime, not a moment of weakness or fear. Aguilar's cooperation with Robinson had been voluntary, and that reality would form the foundation of the prosecution's case. The Guillen family continued to press for justice, both in Aguilar's trial and in their broader campaign to hold the Army accountable. Their voices carried into congressional hearings and media interviews, demanding that the system that had failed Vanessa be reformed. Across the country, service members stepped forward under the banner of I Am Vanessa Guillen, sharing their own stories of harassment, abuse, and silence within the military. Vanessa's case had sparked a movement larger than one trial, but for her family, the most immediate concern remained ensuring that Aguilar faced consequences for her role in covering up the murder. Aguilar's legal process stretched on for months, delayed by the complexities of federal court. In 2021 and 2022, hearings revealed more about her actions and her relationship with Robinson. She admitted that she had lied to investigators during the early stages of the case, giving false statements to protect Robinson. Each lie added to the charges against her, making her eventual trial more difficult to defend. Prosecutors emphasized that Aguilar had multiple opportunities to step away or alert authorities, but instead chose to assist Robinson at every turn. In November 2022, Aguilar pleaded guilty to 1 count of accessory to murder after the fact and 3 counts of making false statements. It was a striking admission that confirmed what investigators had long believed. She had been a willing participant in covering up Vanessa's death. By pleading guilty, Aguilar avoided a lengthy trial, but she also sealed her fate in terms of sentencing. For the Guillen family, the plea was both a relief and a painful reminder. It confirmed Aguilar's guilt, yet it also brought back the horrifying details of what had been done to Vanessa's body. The sentencing came in August 2023. Aguilar, then 25 years old, stood before a federal judge in Waco, Texas. The courtroom was filled with the weight of 3 years of grief, anger, and determination. Members of Vanessa's family spoke about their loss, about the bright young soldier whose life had been cut short, and about the torment they endured not knowing her fate for so many weeks. Their words captured not only their personal pain, but also the broader injustice that had galvanized a movement. The judge sentenced Aguilar to 30 years in federal prison. It was the maximum punishment allowed under the charges she faced. The decision closed one chapter of the case, ensuring that Aguilar would spend the majority of her life behind bars. For Vanessa's family, the sentence brought some measure of closure, though it could never erase their loss. The absence of Robinson in the courtroom remained a bitter truth. His suicide had denied them the chance to see him held accountable, but Aguilar's conviction at least ensured that one of those responsible would not escape justice. The conclusion of Aguilar's case did not end the impact of Vanessa's story. In the months after her death, public pressure forced the Army to conduct an independent review of Fort Hood. The report, released in December 2020, described a culture plagued by leadership failures, unaddressed violence, and a climate that left soldiers, particularly women, vulnerable. 14 Army leaders were either fired or suspended as a result of the findings. Vanessa's name became a symbol of reform, and her family's persistence drove significant changes in how the military responds to harassment and assault. Legislation known as the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act was introduced in Congress, aimed at removing decisions on sexual harassment and assault from the military chain of command and placing them in the hands of independent investigators. The act represented a direct response to Vanessa's story, reflecting the idea that her suffering should not be in vain. While military reform is slow and often contested, her case ensured that the conversation could not be ignored. The story of Cecily Aguilar and Aaron Robinson is a dark reminder of what happens when violence festers unchecked. Robinson was a young soldier who turned on one of his own, murdering Vanessa in cold blood. Aguilar, a civilian tied to him by a turbulent relationship, chose to help him conceal the crime rather than stop it. Together, they tried to erase Vanessa's existence by desecrating her body and hiding it in shallow graves. Their actions revealed not only the brutality of the crime, but also the depths of their betrayal of trust. For Vanessa's family, the tragedy reshaped their lives. Her parents and sisters carried the weight of her absence every day, yet they transformed their grief into a fight for justice that extended far beyond their own case. They became the faces of a movement, unwilling to let Vanessa's memory fade or her death go unanswered. In the end, Aguilar's conviction marked the final step in the criminal case, but the broader impact of Vanessa Guillen's story continues to reverberate. It is a story about a young soldier who dreamed of serving her country, a family that refused to give up on her, a crime that exposed deep flaws within a powerful institution, and a movement that demanded change. The sentencing of Cecily Aguilar ensured that those who tried to erase Vanessa would face consequences, but it was the relentless determination of her family and supporters that ensured Vanessa's name will endure as a symbol of courage, justice, and reform. A decorated Air Force staff sergeant survives overseas missions, only to vanish in small-town Texas. His wife, a respected veterinarian, claims he walked away. But beneath the calm surface lies betrayal, poison, and murder. This is the chilling case of Wendy Mae Davidson and Michael Severance. In the winter of 2005, the quiet city of San Angelo, Texas, became the backdrop for a case that would shock both the local community and the Air Force family. At the center of it were two people whose lives appeared to follow very different paths, yet had been bound together by marriage. Wendy Mae Davidson, a veterinarian in her early 30s, and Michael Severance, a 24-year-old staff sergeant in the United States Air Force. On the surface, theirs looked like the story of a hard-working young couple building a life together in a modest West Texas town. But beneath that appearance were tensions and private struggles that would eventually spiral into a tragedy no one around them could have anticipated. Michael Severance had grown up in Maine, raised in a close-knit family that valued hard work, service, and loyalty. Friends and relatives described him as quiet but dependable, someone who had always carried himself with a steady seriousness. Joining the Air Force at a young age, he served with distinction, completing tours overseas and gaining a reputation as disciplined and reliable. At 24, stationed at Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene, Texas, He was already accomplished for his age and looked forward to the stability of home life after experiencing the rigors of military duty. Wendy Mae Davidson's life took shape in San Angelo, where she pursued her education and established herself as a veterinarian. Those who knew her professionally saw her as intelligent and capable, someone trusted with the care of animals and admired for her dedication. She came from a respected family in the area, and by the time she met Michael, she was already recognized in the community for her career and independence. Their worlds intersected quickly, and just as quickly, they married, bringing together a young man devoted to military service and a woman anchored in her veterinary practice. To friends and family, their relationship seemed promising at first. Michael embraced his new role not only as Wendy's husband, but also as a father figure to her young son. They lived in San Angelo, balancing the demands of his military life with her long hours at the clinic. Yet behind closed doors, the marriage carried strain. Family members later recalled that arguments were frequent and that the couple seemed mismatched in many ways. Michael's grounded, disciplined approach to life sometimes clashed with Wendy's temperament and her need for control. Even in the early months of their marriage, there were signs of tension that hinted at deeper problems. The turning point in this story began quietly. In January 2005, Michael failed to appear where he was expected. He did not show up for duties at the base, something entirely out of character for a man who had spent his adult life in strict adherence to schedules and responsibilities. At first, the absence raised questions more than alarm. Perhaps he had taken some time off or was dealing with personal stress. But when days passed without any word, without activity on his bank accounts or communication with his family, suspicion began to grow. His disappearance did not fit the man people knew him to be. It was Wendy who first explained Michael's absence to those around her. She suggested he had gone off on his own, that perhaps the pressures of military service and home life had pushed him to seek distance. But her account did not match what investigators and family members understood about Michael's character. He had always been steady, loyal, and present. He had responsibilities not only to the Air Force but to his family, and abandoning them without explanation was unimaginable to those who knew him best. As the days stretched into weeks, concern deepened. Michael's father and brother, both back in Maine, pressed for answers, insisting that his disappearance was not voluntary. Law enforcement in San Angelo began an investigation, focusing first on the most obvious possibilities. But as they questioned Wendy, they noticed inconsistencies in her story. Details shifted. Explanations did not line up. And as they looked closer, more troubling clues emerged. Michael's car was found abandoned, and financial records showed that his accounts remained untouched. A man preparing to leave his life behind would have taken money, belongings, or at the very least made contact with family. Michael had done none of these things. Investigators also noted the circumstances of Wendy's behavior. Rather than appearing distraught or panicked over her husband's disappearance, she remained composed, sometimes even detached. In interviews, her explanations seemed rehearsed, her answers evasive. This unease, combined with the absence of any sign that Michael had left voluntarily, began to push the investigation toward darker possibilities. Detectives started to suspect that Michael had not simply walked away, but that something violent had occurred. San Angelo was not a place where people expected to uncover crimes of this magnitude. The town, with its blend of ranching culture and small city life, was more accustomed to routine matters than high-profile criminal cases. But as investigators dug deeper, the picture that formed suggested that Michael's disappearance was no ordinary missing person case. It was, increasingly, looking like a matter of life and death. The story's momentum built slowly, but surely. Friends and family of Michael spoke openly about their doubts. They knew him as dependable, a man who would never abandon his duties, never vanish without a word. The Air Force community echoed these sentiments, stressing that his absence violated everything they knew about his character. Each testimony added weight to the suspicion that his disappearance was not a choice but the result of foul play. Meanwhile, Wendy's actions became more closely scrutinized. Investigators began examining her access to controlled substances through her veterinary work. They explored her movements in the days following Michael's disappearance, piecing together a timeline that raised more questions than it answered. Though no body had yet been found, the inconsistencies in her story and the growing evidence of deception pointed to the likelihood that something terrible had happened. By this point, the investigation had transformed the case into one of the most significant in the region. Local authorities, with the support of military officials, focused their efforts on finding out what had happened to Michael Severance. They combed through leads, searched properties, and interviewed those closest to the couple. Each step brought them closer to the truth, though the full scope of events had yet to be revealed. As the investigation moved forward in San Angelo, the mystery of Michael Severance's disappearance began to tighten around Wendy Mae Davidson. Detectives had already grown wary of her shifting explanations, and the more they studied her behavior, the more convinced they became that she was hiding something. For law enforcement, it was not just about what she said, but also about what she avoided saying. Her words carried gaps, her timelines carried contradictions, and her composure in the face of what should have been devastating news only deepened suspicion. The search for Michael had grown urgent. The Air Force, recognizing the seriousness of the case, offered its support, while Michael's family in Maine pushed relentlessly for answers. His father and brother could not accept the idea that Michael had left on his own. They described him as devoted to his duties and loyal to his family, the type of man who never ignored responsibility. To them, his vanishing without a trace was impossible. These convictions added weight to the case and encouraged investigators to treat the situation as more than just a missing person report. Detectives began piecing together Michael's final days. Witnesses recalled seeing him with Wendy, but after a certain point in mid-January 2005, the sighting stopped. Wendy claimed that he had been restless, that he wanted space, and suggested he might have been struggling internally. But her narrative did not fit with what investigators knew of his background. Michael had endured overseas deployments and military discipline. He was not someone to collapse under pressure without leaving a trace. What stood out more than her words was her access to means and opportunity. As a veterinarian, Wendy had knowledge of drugs that could incapacitate or even kill. This detail would later prove critical. As suspicion mounted, investigators began focusing their searches beyond the city. The landscape surrounding San Angelo was vast, dotted with ranches, ponds, and open land that could conceal evidence. It was in this context that they discovered an unsettling detail. Wendy had spent time at a rural property not long after Michael vanished. She had access to a ranch pond not far from town, and her movements during those critical days lined up with opportunities to dispose of evidence. The discovery would eventually lead to the most important breakthrough in the case. In March 2005, after weeks of exhaustive searching, investigators finally located Michael's body. It had been submerged in a pond on a ranch outside San Angelo, weighted down with car parts to keep it hidden beneath the surface. When his remains were examined, the truth of what had happened became horrifyingly clear. Michael had not simply disappeared. He had been poisoned with drugs and then stabbed multiple times before his body was dumped. The combination of poisoning and stabbing showed both premeditation and violence, suggesting a desperate attempt not only to kill, but to ensure he could not survive. This discovery transformed the case. What had been a mystery was now a confirmed homicide. The physical evidence spoke volumes, and investigators now had the tragic confirmation that Michael's family had feared. For law enforcement, the focus turned fully to building the case against Wendy. They retraced her steps, looked at her clinic records, and examined her access to veterinary drugs. It became increasingly clear that the poisoning had likely come from substances she obtained through her profession. The stabbing, in turn, pointed to a more personal, direct act of violence, carried out to finish what the drugs had started. The discovery of Michael's body also marked the emotional breaking point for his family. From the beginning, they had insisted he would never abandon them, and now their worst fears were confirmed. For his father and brother, the news was devastating but not surprising. They had suspected foul play from the start, and now the confirmation only deepened their grief. The Air Force community also reacted with shock, mourning the loss of a young man who had served honorably and whose life had been cut short not in combat, but in his own home life. With the evidence mounting, Wendy's position became increasingly precarious. Detectives pressed her on inconsistencies, but she remained elusive in her answers. At times, she portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, as someone caught up in events beyond her control. At other times, she leaned on explanations that painted Michael as unstable or prone to leaving. None of it aligned with the reality investigators uncovered. Forensic evidence from the pond, the pattern of her movements, and her access to lethal substances pointed clearly in her direction. As investigators built their case, the question of motive lingered. Why would a woman with a stable career and young children kill her husband? The answer seemed to lie in the private conflicts of the marriage. Those close to the couple spoke of frequent arguments and a sense of imbalance in their relationship. Wendy had a strong need for control, and Michael's steady but firm personality may have clashed with that. Some speculated that she feared losing custody of her children if the marriage dissolved. Others suggested she wanted to rid herself of Michael without facing the complications of divorce. Whatever the specific reasoning, it became clear that the motive was tied to personal conflict, not a sudden act of rage. For prosecutors, the challenge was not only proving Wendy's guilt, but also establishing the sequence of events. They laid out a timeline in which she first poisoned Michael with veterinary drugs, rendering him vulnerable. When the drugs did not kill him quickly, she stabbed him repeatedly to finish the act. Finally, she transported his body to the rural pond, weighing it down with heavy car parts in an effort to conceal it. The steps spoke of planning, opportunity, and a willingness to carry out extreme violence to solve what she may have seen as a personal problem. As news of the discovery spread, the case drew wider attention beyond San Angelo. The story of an Air Force staff sergeant murdered by his wife, a respected veterinarian, captured national headlines. It was a story filled with contradictions. A young military man who had survived overseas deployments only to be killed in his hometown, and a professional woman who had devoted her career to caring for animals, but used her expertise to commit murder. The shocking contrast added to the sense of betrayal and tragedy. By the time the body was recovered and the evidence analyzed, investigators were confident they had assembled a solid case. Still, the legal process would take time. Prosecutors knew they had the responsibility to pursue justice carefully, ensuring that the evidence was presented clearly and thoroughly. For Michael's family, the wait was agonizing, but they remained determined to see accountability. As 2005 drew on, the investigation reached its final stages. Wendy, once seen as a respected figure in San Angelo, was now the prime suspect in a homicide case that carried devastating consequences for both families involved. Michael's family braced themselves for the court proceedings, holding onto memories of the dependable young man they had lost. The Air Force community continued to honor his service, even as the story of his death grew darker with each revelation. The case had now shifted from mystery to prosecution. What had begun as a missing person report had unfolded into a clear story of deception, violence, and betrayal. The discovery of Michael Severance's body in a rural Texas pond, poisoned and stabbed, left no doubt about the nature of the crime. For the investigators and prosecutors, the task ahead was to ensure that the woman responsible would be held accountable. For Michael's family, the search for justice was only beginning. When Michael Severance's body was recovered from a ranch pond, weighed down with car parts and showing clear signs of poisoning and stabbing, the investigation had reached its grim conclusion. What remained was the question of accountability, of how the legal system would handle the case against the woman at the center of it all, Wendy Mae Davidson. For detectives and prosecutors, the evidence told a consistent story. For Michael's family, it was the final confirmation of what they had feared since the moment they learned he was missing. Now, the focus shifted from discovery to justice. Wendy's arrest was not unexpected. By the time the body was located and examined, she had already been under heavy suspicion, her explanations dismantled by both forensic evidence and witness testimony. Investigators confronted her with the facts: her access to veterinary drugs, her erratic statements, and the undeniable reality that her husband's remains had been found in a pond connected to property she had visited. The scientific analysis of the toxic substances in Michael's system pointed directly to veterinary medications she had access to, and the stab wounds reinforced the violence that went beyond a simple poisoning. At every step, the trail led back to her. Still, Wendy did not respond with an outright confession. She chose instead to remain evasive, sometimes suggesting Michael had left voluntarily, other times shifting the narrative to emphasize her own challenges. Her reluctance to provide a clear account forced prosecutors to build their case from the ground up, relying on evidence and expert testimony rather than admissions. They were prepared to demonstrate how carefully the crime had been carried out, how Michael had been first poisoned to weaken him, then stabbed to ensure death, and finally disposed of in a pond, his body anchored by scrap metal in a desperate attempt to keep it hidden. As the case moved into the legal system, the public followed closely. The idea of a veterinarian, someone trusted to heal animals, using her expertise to kill her husband was shocking, and the story gained attention across the country. Newspapers and television outlets recounted the strange and tragic circumstances. An Air Force staff sergeant who had survived the risks of service overseas, only to be betrayed and murdered at home by the woman he trusted most. The contradiction made the case unforgettable. In the courtroom, prosecutors presented the details with methodical precision. They introduced the toxicology reports, the accounts of investigators, and the testimonies from Michael's fellow service members and family. Each element reinforced the narrative of a man who would not abandon his duties and whose life had been deliberately taken. The evidence of poisoning connected directly to Wendy's access as a veterinarian, and the violence of the stabbing highlighted the personal nature of the crime. The presence of car parts used to weigh down his body underscored the lengths she had gone to conceal what she had done. For Michael's family, attending the proceedings was both painful and necessary. They traveled from Maine to Texas, determined to bear witness to the process. They listened as their son and brother was described not as a missing person, but as a victim of calculated murder. Their grief was evident, but so too was their determination to see accountability delivered. They spoke about Michael as loyal and steady, a young man who had earned respect through service, and whose loss was immeasurable. As the trial loomed, Wendy faced the weight of the evidence against her. Her legal team negotiated with prosecutors, and eventually, she chose to enter a plea of no contest to the charges of murder and tampering with evidence. By doing so, she did not admit guilt outright, but accepted punishment as though she had. This decision avoided a lengthy trial and spared Michael's family from reliving every detail in front of a jury, though it also meant Wendy never provided a clear personal account of why she had done what she did. The lack of a direct confession left lingering questions about motive, though prosecutors and investigators maintained that the central reason lay in personal conflict, control, and the pressures within the marriage. In 2006, the sentencing brought closure to the courtroom phase of the case. Wendy Mae Davidson was sentenced to 25 years in prison for her role in Michael's death. The conviction was seen as a measure of justice, though for many, including Michael's family, no punishment could truly account for the loss of his life. For them, the sentencing was less about relief and more about recognition that the system had acknowledged what happened and that the person responsible would face consequences. The conclusion of the case left the community of San Angelo shaken. Those who had known Wendy as a professional found it difficult to reconcile the image of a respected veterinarian with the woman convicted of murdering her husband. For Michael's fellow airmen, it was a harsh reminder that danger does not always come from a battlefield. They honored his service and remembered him as someone who had lived by duty and loyalty, values that made the betrayal of his death even more painful. Beyond the courtroom, the story of Wendy Mae Davidson and Michael Severance continued to resonate. True crime outlets, documentaries, and national media revisited the case, drawn to its haunting details and stark contrasts. The theme that emerged was one of betrayal within the closest relationship, a young man who had faced combat zones only to be killed in his own home, and a woman who chose violence as her way out of personal conflict. It was a story that illustrated how appearances can mask darker realities and how the bonds of marriage, expected to be built on trust, could instead become the setting for tragedy. Michael's family returned to Maine carrying the weight of both grief and memory. They continued to speak of him as a loyal son, a brother who could be counted on, and a man whose life, though cut short, had been marked by honor and service. Their loss was enduring, and the pain of his death was something they would carry for years to come. Yet their persistence in pressing for answers had ensured that his disappearance was not dismissed or forgotten, that the truth was uncovered, and that justice, however imperfect, was pursued. For Wendy, prison became the stark end to what had once been a promising life. The veterinarian, who had once been respected in her community, was now known primarily as the woman who poisoned and stabbed her husband before leaving him to sink in a Texas pond. Her story was a reminder of how personal conflict, unchecked and unresolved, could turn into destructive acts with irreversible consequences. In the end, the case of Wendy Mae Davidson and Michael Severance became one of those tragic narratives that combined elements of trust, betrayal, and the quiet unraveling of a marriage. It underscored the reality that even in quiet towns, behind the walls of ordinary homes, dark choices can take shape, hidden until the consequences are impossible to ignore. For San Angelo, for the Air Force, and most of all for Michael's family, the case left an indelible mark. It was a reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating impact of violence when it comes from within the closest circles. What began as a puzzling disappearance had unfolded into a chilling story of murder, deception, and loss. By the time the case closed, the narrative was clear. An Air Force staff sergeant in his 20s, loyal to his family and service, had been betrayed by the woman who should have been his partner. His life ended not on foreign soil, but in the depths of a Texas pond. And his story remained a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that can exist in the most intimate parts of life.